No mai haere mai, piki mai, kaki mai, kia ora e tiwi, and welcome to 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We do 30 minutes with one guest and no cuts, so what we record is what you get. Gary Stevenson, he was a working class kid from East London who used his smarts to win a trading game competition and score himself an internship with a leading bank. To the surprise of his upper class colleagues and bosses, he was very good at it and became one of the biggest traders in the world. He made millions of pounds, but came to the realisation that the economic system in most capitalist countries meant that rising inequality would eventually chew up the lower and middle classes. Gary Stevenson wrote about his experience in his book, The Trading Game, and is now a high-profile advocate for increasing tax on the rich. He's bringing his remarkable story to New Zealand with the People's Economist Tour in Auckland next March. But we've got in early, so let's start the clock. 30 minutes with Gary Stevenson. Gary Stevenson, welcome to 30.
Thanks for having me, Guyon.
We'll get to some of the solutions that you have for dealing with inequality later in the interview, but for the uninitiated, I want to get them on the same journey that you went on. Now, you deal in odds as a trader. What are the chances of a poor kid from East London expelled from school for selling cannabis winding up as a top trader at Citibank?
It's very unusual nowadays. It's a funny one, really, because I don't know if you're aware of this over in New Zealand, but we have this kind of myth of like the Cockney wide boy trader here in London. And I think if you go back to the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of East Londoners working in trading. Our financial districts are in East London, but the industry changed massively in the late 90s, 2000s, and it became kind of trading basically became the most desirable job for the kids of the extremely rich, basically. So by the time I turned up on the trading floor in 2006 was the first time I went there, it was almost entirely kids from very wealthy families. Yeah, so I went to the London School of Economics, which is this like incredibly prestigious university here in London, economics university. And you know, it's like Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, sent his kids there, and it's that kind of place. So yeah, by the time I got onto the trading floor, despite it being just here in East London, yeah, very, very few kids, even with this accent from this area in the space, never mind people who got expelled from school. So yeah, it was unlucky. It was unlikely, yeah.
And that's part of the story, isn't it? Part of your story is a story of class that to some degree your colleagues and the people you were kind of competing with heard your accent, looked at you and underestimated you.
Well, yeah, story of my life, really. And I think it was, it's a funny one because I was always very, very talented student ever since I was young, very good at maths, things like that. Grew up in a very immigrant area, always from a very poor family. But everybody knew, you know, Gaz is the kid who is the best at maths. And it was only really when I went to that fancy university, I remember in my first year, I got like pretty good grades. And then in my second year, nobody could believe it. They were like, how did this kid get such good grades? And that's when I sort of realized like, well, these guys actually think we're stupid, basically. And in a weird way, that's kind of how I got the job because we had this problem. My whole plan at university was just basically go there and like come first in every exam. And that's how you're going to get the job. But when I got there, I found out in my second year, the way you actually get a job at a big investment bank nowadays is you have to get an internship in your second year. Now, that was a massive problem for me, right? Because my whole plan was to get the best grades. And then I turn up and find out that the jobs are given out before the grades are given out. So if the jobs are given out before the grades are given out, how do they decide who to give the jobs to? But obviously, it's on extracurriculars. And you can imagine, right? I'm going to university with like the kids of like billionaires. You can imagine what their extracurriculars look like compared to mine. Like I was trying to become a rapper and working in a sofa shop fluffing pillows. And these guys are like founding the Junior United Nations, you know, playing the clarinet in the Royal Albert Hall, basically. But it meant that I had to win my job in a card game, which was called The Trading Game, which is where the book The Trading Game gets its name from. Yeah, I was just in the library one day and some guy came up to me and said, look, do you know Citibank hires one trader a year through this card game? And I thought, well, at least I don't have to play the clarinet at the Royal Albert Hall. So I went in for this card game. You know, it was a maths game. I was good at maths. I was good at games. The whole story of that is in the book. But really, a big part of the way that I won that was because, as you say, people didn't expect somebody who looked or sounded like me to be smart. So I could use these like phenomenally aggressive strategies. And rather than other people thinking, oh, he knows what he's doing, they were thinking, he doesn't know what he's doing, basically, which meant I was able to use that. And I think it really adds a kind of nice comedy element to the whole book. This is, you know, I'm a lot smaller than these big sort of wealthy guys. And yeah, they're constantly not expecting me to be very successful in my
Yeah,
trading and my predictions. But
yeah,
yeah, I was
yeah,
good at my job.
yeah. It's a bit of a good Will Hunting sort of story there, but I'll leave that to readers of the book. When you get in there and you're starting to do well, they give you the Kiwi dollar book or the New Zealand dollar FX swaps book, and you say it was a shit book, it was the shittest book on the desk, but it was a bit of a compliment. I just wanted to take a quick diversion here because I'm quite interested in this because the New Zealand currency, the New Zealand dollar, is consistently among the top traded 10 currencies in the world, even though we're such a tiny economy. And I'm just wondering if we can take a quick diversion into why that might be. I mean, is it the carry trade? So traders are borrowing on assets on low interest countries and then putting it into countries like New Zealand, which often have higher interest rates. I mean, why is the Kiwi dollar so fluid and so traded, do you reckon, Gary?
Yeah, a big part of it is the way that we split up the currencies in the world and the way that we view them. So in at Citibank, and I think at pretty much all the big banks, we split the currencies up into what they call G10, which is the 10, I guess, rich world. You might want to call it Western, although New Zealand is conspicuously not in the West. You know, rich world economies and what they would call emerging markets. So there's these 10 basically really European and colonial currencies, which is the Western European currencies, euro, pound, Swiss franc, the Scandi currencies, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Australia, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, and Japan. And these are like the G10 currencies. And these are just the ones which are kind of allowed to trade. You know, everything else is seen as like exotic and dangerous in a way. So I think what you get in New Zealand is it's part of this G10 block, which is very, very traded, but it is the most volatile, probably in most
Yeah.
cases, because it's the smallest country. Tends to have the highest interest rates, though doesn't always have the highest interest rates, which leads to this carry trade. But really, what you're getting is just the fact that most traders are in Europe and in North America, and we just have a lot more visibility on Australia and New Zealand than we would have on, for example, Thailand, you know, which is it's a much bigger country, a much bigger economy, or even something like Russia, you know, because it trades like a rich world, you know, open, free market. It's very actively looked at. But really, it's just a consequence of the way that we split currencies up.
Yeah,
New
right.
Zealand is defined as G10, which makes it a rich world currency.
Yeah, right. Okay, and then you're getting your success. I mean, I think you were aiming to get £100,000 bonus. You get told you need to make $10 million for the bank. You end up with a bonus close to £400,000 and you're doing pretty well. You offer the reader a secret of trading, and you say this in your book, that making money trading is not about being right. It's about being right when everyone else is wrong. When people are wrong, their predictions are wrong. When people's predictions are wrong, their prices are wrong. And when prices are wrong, we make millions. So is that the key thing, is it?
So there's a few different kind of popular trading styles. A lot of people like to sort of go with the flow and try and jump on the trend. But really, I think it's true what I say. The real big money is made when you put a bet on that everybody else thinks is wrong. So if everybody thinks something's going to happen and you bet on it and it happens, unless you've bet some enormous amount of money, you're not going to make much on it. I think you can think of it in terms of sports betting, right? Like, you know, if you go and bet that, you know, Arsenal or Manchester City are going to win the Premier League, or, you know, the biggest team in your country is going to win the league, and that happens, you're not going to make a lot of money. But, you know, a few years ago, we had Leicester City, which is a tiny football club, win the league here, and that was a massive, massive deal. Like, really, if you're able to spot the things that nobody thinks could possibly happen before they happen and you bet on that, that is when you make the big money. And I think in economics and in trading, because everyone's got an economics degree, they tend to think in the same way. And, if you look at the period that I've been trading, in the book, it's 2008 till 2014, or even up till now, even during COVID, we've had all of these long periods where all of the smartest people in the room are consistently wrong. So I do think there's a lot of money to be made on understanding really specifically why it is that the majority of economists are frequently wrong. And that's the story of my book. It's the story of my career. It's even the story of my YouTube, really. It's a big part of what I do.
Yeah, well, let's crack into that and get to the core sort of foundational principle for you, which is inequality. I mean, you write in your book that by the beginning of 2011, you realised the market was wrong and that the interest rates wouldn't bounce back post-GFC, post the global financial crisis. What role did you think that rising inequality played in that story?
I thought it was central. Well, I want to be clear, right? So I studied economics at a fancy economics university, and I know the theory. So at the time, and still now, people thought that you can manage an economy by managing interest rates, right? And in 2008, interest rates went to zero. That was unprecedented at the time. It happened all over the world, and everybody thought that that was going to have a massive stimulative effect on the economy. And I started working full time in 2008. And then I saw everybody predict a recovery for 2009. Didn't happen. In 2009, everybody predicted a recovery for 2010. It didn't happen. In 2010, everybody predicted one for 2011. It didn't happen. And it was only really the beginning of 2011 that I started to become suspicious that maybe these guys don't know what they're doing, basically. And I just wanted to understand at the time, why was the economy so weak despite those low interest rates? So the way it's supposed to work is not really that complicated. Low interest rates are supposed to get people like you, people like the listeners, people like the British public, the New Zealand public, out into the shops and spending money. And it wasn't happening, right? So it could be boiled down to a pretty simple question of why don't people spend more money? So I had the kind of revolutionary idea, and I think here I was probably benefited by the fact that I came from a more ordinary background. I just went and started asking people, why don't you spend more money? And if you've never done it, Guillaume, I recommend you do it, because you'll probably learn something, but I suspect maybe you don't have to. I think you could probably guess, if you go out and ask people, why don't you spend more money? Most of them are going to say, I don't have any more money to spend. And at that time, I started to look at the financial situation of my friends and their families. And what I saw, 2011, was my parents' generation, ordinary people, not with exceptional jobs or degrees, owning property, buying houses, owning property. And then what I saw in my generation was kids with a degree, advanced education, who would never be able to own property. So what you're seeing there is families going from being property owning families to non-property owning families. Now, if that's what's happening, you can't turn around and ask these guys, why don't you spend more? Because in the long run, they're on the way to zero. And the big thing that happened in 2011 was the sovereign debt crisis in Europe, which was when we saw all of these European governments basically run out of money. They couldn't spend any more. The big thing that hit me about that was the situation of the governments in Europe and also in the US, in Japan, was the same as the situation of these working class families, spending more than their income, going into debt, losing their assets. And what really struck me about this, and I think this is as relevant today as it was in 2011, it's not possible for everybody to go into debt. We have to be in debt to somebody. Somebody has to be on the other side of that debt. Somebody has to be accumulating cash and credit. It's not possible for everybody to lose their homes. Somebody has to own the homes. And that's when I realized, obviously, I was sitting there thinking, where's it going? Where's the debt going? Who's owning the properties? But of course, I'm working here in Canary Wharf in London in a skyscraper surrounded by millionaires, So you could see it, you could see it. What was happening then is the same thing that's happening now, is that ordinary families and governments that are running welfare states have lost their assets. And they have lost those assets to the very rich. And if that continues, then of course, governments and working class families will have to stop spending because you can only sell your house once. And I realized that in 2011, I realized what I still believe firmly now is that living standards and the economy were being driven down by growing inequality. And I started to bet on that very aggressively in 2011. And that is the year that I became Citibank's most profitable trader in the world.
Yeah, now let's move to what you see are the solutions. And your central argument nowadays it seems to be for a wealth tax. I know that you had Chloe Swarbrick, the New Zealand Green Party co-leader, on your podcast. The Greens have a policy of a 2.5% tax on assets over 2 million. Your thresholds might be a little different. I think you work in a sort of 10 million pound plus metric, don't you? But it's the same kind of idea. Why do you advocate for a wealth tax?
I think if you don't do anything, if you leave the system as it is, then wealth inequality will increase very rapidly. That's not an abstract concept. What that means is the rich get richer and richer, and everybody else loses their assets. What that means is ordinary families can't afford to buy homes. Ordinary families need to take enormous amounts of debt. It means the bankrupting of governments, which means the shutting down of welfare states. I mean, we're seeing that very visibly now here in the UK. I think in the absence of action, you will see really, really rapid increases in poverty. And we're seeing that here in the UK, and I'm pretty confident you're also seeing that over there in New Zealand. So staying with the status quo, I think, is not going to work. We have a tax system in most countries, definitely over here, and I'm pretty sure over there as well, where we tax working people pretty aggressively, pretty high rates, and yet the very wealthiest in our country often inherit billions and pay nothing. If you don't do anything about that, it is pretty obviously going to take you to a situation where in the long run, working families lose their homes, the government loses its assets, and everything is owned by the very rich. I would encourage, the Kiwi public out there to read their history books about what history was like in Europe. Thousands of years of desperate poverty surrounding a tiny, super, super wealthy elite. If we don't do anything, that's where we go.
Okay.
And of course, you don't have that history of inequality, but you'll have that future if you don't do something, and so will we.
Yeah, and we've got considerable inequality in New Zealand, and we'll get to that in a second. But if we look at some of the arguments against wealth taxes, because many European countries have had them, just doing some research on this, in 1990, 12 countries in Europe had a wealth tax. Today, I think only 3, Norway, Spain and Switzerland. And it seems as though they largely ditched them. Well, there was some difficulty administering them, valuing them, the assets, that sort of thing. But the main concern, and I'd be interested to hear your response to this, is fears of capital flight. And the best example I could find was reporting that 42,000 millionaires had left France between 2000 and 2012, with the wealth tax as a major contributor to that. And then France went and ditched it, I think, 2018, 2019. But you know the argument, right? It basically boils down to the fact that while it might be bad to have lots of millionaires in your country, it's worse to have none. And if you get this capital flight problem, then that can damage the economy. What is your response to that argument?
Yeah, I think capital flight is a legitimate risk. I think it's a legitimate risk, but it's something that we can deal with. It's something that we can deal with. I think governments like to pretend you can't tax billionaires because if you tax them, they'll leave. But the interesting thing about billionaires is they own your country. And what I mean is they own your land, and they own your buildings, and they own your mortgages, and they own your government debt. If we were to bring in a tax on, TV presenters, you could be on the first plane to Dubai and you could be doing your job there. But what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine and suddenly the British government decides it's going to tax Roman Abramovich, one of the biggest Russian billionaires who was at the time living in London? Okay, he's on the first flight to Moscow, but because he's a billionaire, what does he own? Chelsea Football Club, a massive football club here in London. Well, what do? We just freeze the asset. We freeze the cash flows. These very, very wealthy people, they own assets in your country. They own your land. They own your property. They own your mortgages. You can tax them whether they leave or not. Now, listen, if we were Chinese and we owned $10 billion of Chinese assets, and the Chinese government comes to us and says, well, where's the tax on those assets? And we say, oh, well, I live in New Zealand. I'm not paying it. They're going to take the tax anyway. These guys, these people are not making money from their work. They are making money because they own your country. They own your land. They own your natural resources. They own your property. They own your mortgages. They own your debt. You have to make a choice, basically. Do you want the people who own your country to pay tax or not to pay tax? And that's a choice that the New Zealand public can make. But if you choose to allow them not to pay tax, you cannot be surprised when the ordinary public becomes impoverished in the long term.
I'm just wondering whether you think you need a degree of international coordination about this, and I know there have been attempts to, haven't there, through
Yeah.
various, international groupings. And you see this, don't you, in the big tech companies, how they just move their money around so that we get it in New Zealand. You get a massive company like Google, which earns
Yeah.
more than $1 billion in revenue in New Zealand, and then sends about $1 billion of it offshore and pays a small amount of tax in New
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Zealand. So, capital's so fluid now, isn't it? Do you need some degree of international coordination on this, do you think?
It would massively help. It would massively help. And I'll be honest, that's why I'm here speaking to you now. That's the reason I'm speaking to you now. That's the reason I'm coming to New Zealand early next year. That's the reason I'm going to Australia. I've been touring Europe. I think this will be much, much, much easier if we do it together, especially when you're considering a small country like New Zealand. There are things you can do by yourself, but it will be much, much easier to do it together. I think if we look at the history of inequality in the last, 100, 200, 500 years, especially in Europe, what you see is inequality was very, very high for a long period, and it suddenly falls basically everywhere after the Second World War.
Yeah.
And it fell because we all decided together we were no longer going to accept these economies, which were phenomenally unequal. Listen, my grandma was born here in London, in the richest city, in the richest country in the history of the world. And 3 of her siblings died of tuberculosis, a disease of poverty, in the 20th century, here in the richest city, in the richest country in the world. That is what happens if you allow wealth to be unequally distributed. And within 20, 30 years, what you have here in this country is a country where an ordinary person like my dad, working for the post office, can buy his own home, can have 3 kids, can have food on the table, can have heating, education, healthcare. That was done by distribution, and we did it together. We did it together. So I've got to be honest, I think this will be much, much, much easier if we work together. But there's no reason why we can't. I see the statistics on my channel. I know we're popular in New Zealand, in Australia, in Europe, in America. These problems, which we have here, which you have there, unaffordable housing, not enough good jobs, not enough government services, we're seeing them here, we're seeing them everywhere. Let's work together and fix this together.
In New Zealand, forget about a wealth tax. We don't even have a capital gains tax or an inheritance tax. We abolished inheritance tax in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
Were you surprised? Are you surprised at that? We don't have any of those taxes on wealth at all, really.
No, I'm not surprised because tax is unpopular. Tax is unpopular, and it's often very popular for politicians to say they're going to cut tax. And I think New Zealand, similarly in some ways to Australia, was able to get away with that for a long time because it has very low population density, which means there's a lot of wealth there. Really, by rights, New Zealand should be a rich country because there's not a lot of people there. There's a phenomenal amount of natural wealth per person. It can sustain a good quality of life for every single person in the country. The problem you have is once you start cutting those taxes on the rich very, very quickly start to increase their share of the wealth. And inevitably, that starts to squeeze people out. I think people in New Zealand, you should look at what happens to countries in Africa, Latin America, huge countries with enormous amounts of natural resources where people should be rich, but they allow inequality to spiral out of control. I think the problem you have is your ordinary person doesn't realize that if I cut inheritance tax for the very, very rich, then they will outcompete my kids for the house that they need. They don't realize that. They think we live in an infinite economy. They don't realize that if you don't tax the rich will squeeze you out. And that's the whole reason why I've written my book, why I've got my YouTube channel, why I'm doing this talk with you now, why I'm coming to New Zealand. Because what I want to make people aware of is tax is not just about punishment. Tax is about protecting your share of the pie. If you accept a situation where the rich grow their share every year, then of course your share and your family's share will eventually be squeezed to nothing.
And I think the Green Party in Britain has adopted your wealth tax policy, but
They have, yeah.
But the centre-left Labour Party is not going to do that, are they? So how would you assess the appetite for the kinds of policies that you're advocating?
Well, it's super interesting, right? So if you poll the public, it's unbelievably popular. So, and not just, Labour is our centre. The Greens have adopted it. They love it. Labour supporters and voters love it. Even the Conservatives in the centre right and Reform on the far right, even their voters overwhelmingly support a wealth tax if you poll the voters. It is only the politicians who are blocking it, basically, which puts obviously me in an interesting situation. It's disappointing. It's obviously disappointing. I think if governments don't do anything, then they will continually find themselves in a situation where the wealth is being accumulated by a small minority of people that the governments refuse to tax. And if that's your situation, governments will have no choice but to either tax the middle class or shut down the welfare state. And you're seeing that. I'm not sure how far along you are on that in New Zealand, but I would really ask the New Zealand public, look at what's happening here in the UK, where we are shutting down the welfare state that our grandparents fought and died for, and raising tax on the middle class while the super rich pay nothing. The public wants it. The public wants it. And I think Labour, who are in power now, I think either they give us what we want on wealth taxes, or they'll fail on the economy and they will lose the next election. But I'm hoping there's enough smart people in the Labour Party to realise that and to come and speak to me and help us work on developing that wealth tax.
Why do you think politicians, especially of the centre left, who should be, you would think, at least open to these ideas, why do you think that they see this as a kind of third rail issue, one that you touch it and you die? Why are they so nervous to look at policies like this, do you think?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I wish I knew with certainty what the answer was. I think they're scared. I think they're scared of the rich. The fact is, this policy is opposed by the vast majority of the richest and most powerful people, not just in Britain, but in the whole world. And if they go for this, these guys, they own the newspapers, they own the TV stations. These guys are scared that the press and the TV stations are going to turn against them. I think also you have to accept that most of these guys, I come from a poor background and I've been an economist, I've been a trader, I'm in the media. There's a certain group of people who are in this conversation about whether or not we should have a wealth tax. It's a group of politicians and economists and journalists and people in the media, and not a single one of them is poor or from a poor background. And the problem you have is an economic crisis of inequality does not hurt everyone. It is extremely good for the people at the top. And in this country, in the vast majority of cases, senior politicians, if they are not very rich when they come into office, which to be honest, they often are, they very quickly become very rich when they leave office. So I think there is an incentive problem here. I think the politicians whose job it is to fix this problem, they benefit from the situation. And this is why I stopped writing for The Guardian and I stopped writing for the broadsheets and I moved to YouTube. Because I don't think we are going to get this wealth tax from a group of politicians who benefit from inequality. I turn to YouTube because I want to speak to the public. Because the people who are going to be hurt here is going to be your ordinary man or woman on the street working a regular job, paying regular bills in a regular house. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm on YouTube. I want to speak to the public. I do not think that the economists and the politicians, who in most cases are rich and comfortable, are going to give this to the British public or the New Zealand public. So I'm here to speak to the New Zealand public and tell them the fire engines are not coming. If you want to fix the economy, you need to demand this of your politicians. You need to demand this yourselves.
Just 3 or 4 minutes left to go. I'm interested to bring this right up to now. Do you still trade?
I do. I didn't trade. So I quit in 2014 professionally. I didn't trade much until 2020. In COVID, at the beginning of COVID, it was so obvious to anyone who wanted to look, which was a surprisingly small number of people, that inequality was going to explode. It was so obvious. And as somebody who was an inequality economist, I knew it was an unbelievably enormous opportunity to make money. So I did two things. I opened up my laptop and I bought £1 million of gold, and I opened up my WordPad and I wrote an article which I sent out to The Guardian. So I've made tons of money on the collapse of living standards, but at least this time I'm also trying to stop it, and I hope the New Zealand public will support me.
I think gold would have probably doubled since you bought that, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it has. It's made me a fair bit, yeah.
So, yeah, give me some advice here. What should I be looking at? Are you worried that do you think that we're going to get this AI bubble, and do you think that's going to burst and create problems?
So I'm not an expert on AI specifically. As a trader, I look at that and it kind of smells like bullshit. I do think there's a lot of overvaluation in there. I suspect at some point things pop. Even if it is a bubble, it's phenomenally difficult to know when the bubble ends. There's obviously a lot of speculation. I think crypto is a ridiculous bubble. AI, yeah, I think it is, but I have to caveat that by saying, I'm not an engineer, I'm not an AI expert, but I'm extremely skeptical of it, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, we really look forward to you coming to New Zealand. That's what, March next year?
March next year, first time in New Zealand. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Thanks very much for speaking with us today, Gary Stevenson.
Thanks
Really
for having me.
appreciate your time. That was 30 Minutes with Gary Stevenson, and this is 30 with me, Guyon Espiner. We'll catch you next time. Ka kite.